Do you like sports? Do you like art? What about science? Giraffes? Giraffe scientists that paint rugby games? It's all available on Audible, the biggest audiobook site with the largest selection of audiobooks this side of the inner solar system. No need to use your boring old eyes anymore. The ears are the future, my friend. Why, you're using them right now. So check out Audible and get your listen on. Go to www.readlearnlivepodcast.com/audible to start your 30-day free trial today.
What Ruth's work was, who she was, and the time that she worked, I really think of her work as a very strong visual representation of mid-century landscape architecture in Southern California. Her work was always referred to as the California look, that kind of thing. People felt that what she did defined this space.
Hello and welcome to Read, Learn, Live, the podcast about improving yourself through literature. I'm your acclaimed host, John Monaster, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 64, where it's apparently summer again here in New York. As always, if you have ideas for books you'd like to see featured or of authors you want to put me in touch with, you can reach me at jon@readlearnlivepodcast.com. Today, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak with author Kelly Comras about her book, Ruth Shellhorn. Kelly Comras is a fellow of the American Society of Landscape Architects and a member of the State Bar of California. Her landscape architectural practice focuses on community-based open space design, research, and publication in the field of cultural landscape. She is a founding member of the Cultural Landscape Foundation Stewardship Council, past president of the California Garden and Landscape History Society, and chaired the editorial board for the journal Eden. She lectures at such institutions as Harvard Graduate School of Design, Society of Architectural Historians, California Preservation Foundation, and others. Her book, Ruth Shellhorn, was released in 2016. I hope you enjoy our conversation as much as I did. All right, everyone. Hello and welcome to the Read, Learn, Live podcast. I'm your host, John Monaster, and I'm very excited to be here today sharing a book called Ruth Shellhorn with you. And I'm with author Kelly Comras. Kelly, say hello.
Hello, nice to be here. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for joining me. It's great to speak with you about this amazing landscape architect. So I think just to kind of kick off the discussion, I always like to ask the author to summarize the book in their own words.
Well, to do that, I'll probably have to explain a little bit about how I came to meet Ruth Shellhorn, which was a little unusual. When I was in graduate school back in the late 1970s, we took a class that required the students to each interview a prominent landscape architect, and the list that they passed out had one woman on it, and it was Ruth Shellhorn. And so I selected that, just thinking how interesting that was. There were not very many women that were very high up in the profession at the time, although they were starting to filter into the profession, at I don't know, about 50% by then. But not very many had come to prominence the way Ruth Shellhorn had. So I went out and interviewed her, and I spent several days driving around Southern California and looking at some of her best projects. And we walked in one day to a place called Bullock's Fashion Square, Sherman Oaks. And my father had taken me there when I was in high school to buy me a prom dress, and it was the first time I had been there. And when we got there and got out of the car, I was so amazed. I felt like we were in a botanical garden. There were these blooming trees all over, and there were hibiscus, and the place really felt almost like a park. And I remembered it, but really never thought about it after that until I revisited it during this tour of her projects and realized this was her work. I was just smitten with her work. Anyway, I did my project and I turned it in. Time went on, and about 25 years later, I was doing a lot of writing at the time, and out of curiosity, I thought it would be interesting to see what kind of work she had done in the ensuing 25 years. And I called her. I still had her phone number, and she picked up the phone and answered it. And she had been retired for several years, but she was in her late 80s, and she was thriving and traveling. And so I arranged to go out and see her one day to have lunch, again, just out of curiosity. But when I got there and she walked me into her office, she showed me these cabinets that she had floor to ceiling with every single drawing she had done since 1933. And they were all alphabetized and tagged with a little label that, named the project. And so I immediately asked her, what's going to happen to this collection now that you're retired? And she said she was alone. She was a widow. She had had no children. She had had no siblings, and she had a trust, and she thought they would come in and throw everything out after she died and sell the house and administer the trust. And I was aghast. So I left that meeting and started making phone calls to different special collections around the Southland. I called USC and UCLA and Cal Poly Pomona and UC Santa Barbara, all of them that have smatterings of collections of landscape architects, and finally settled on UCLA and went to talk with them. And no one had ever heard of Ruth Shellhorn. So when I called UCLA and I said I had this amazing collection, there was a pause on the line, and the woman I was speaking with said, do you know how many times every day I get a call from someone who wants to, fob off the contents of a garage onto special collections? And so I started explaining who Ruth was, and there was another pause, and she said, we are really interested. So I talked to Ruth, and we drove out to UCLA, and she loved the place, and it was open to the public. She thought it would be good. And so really, in just a burst of naive enthusiasm, I said, oh, Ruth, let me help you pack up. And that turned into an over 2-year saga. I went out to her place every 3 weeks, took lunch, and spent the day there going through her materials. We never packed a single thing. We ended up talking about different projects, and she'd pull out a roll of drawings and talk about them. I was either audio taping or taking notes all the time. And I remember the day she took the drawings out for Disneyland. She had rolled them up on July 20th, 1955, a few days after it opened, and she hadn't opened them since. So I was just standing there watching these be unrolled, and I felt like I was, something akin to King Tut's tomb. I was standing there kind of holding my breath, afraid that if I breathed on the paper, it might disappear into dust. But it was the most fascinating experience. And then over time, I thought maybe I'd write an article about her, and we even did a presentation at UCLA for the landscape architecture program, and she came to it. And what had begun as an idea of doing a presentation to one of their classes, their history classes, turned into then the professors wanted to come, and then the program wanted to come. Finally, by the time we gave it, over 100 people were there to see it. And so I knew that the interest I had in her work wasn't something that was singular. It was something that was shared by a lot of people. And so that's how we got started on this process.
Yeah, that's a amazing origin story for the book, I think, and kind of you getting to have that connection with her over a long period of time, I'm sure really helped make the book what it is. So, you went out and did those interviews with her and connected with her and talked with her. How did you then take all of that and turn it into the book as it is now? What was the process you used?
Well, it was clear that I was never going to be able to produce a book before she became old or either died. And also, we talked a lot about doing a book at some point. She was very supportive, and she gave me a lot of her favorite slides and drawings with the idea that if, the trust came in and boxed everything up, they wouldn't get swept up into some, problem where I couldn't access them. So I had those items for several years after she died, and then donated them to UCLA when I was finished with the book. But in the meantime, we really talked and took notes, and I got to know her work, and we went to visit several places. The Imagineers at Disneyland invited us to come out one day, and she walked around with the whole team and talked to them about the design intent of a lot of the work she had done. It was truly fascinating and not something that was available through any other means of research to discover. So we went out to the Marlborough School for Girls campus and spent the afternoon there. And again, she talked about her design intent and the plant materials she used, and so it really offered a really wonderful level of detail that wouldn't have otherwise been available to anyone.
Yeah. And what was the hardest part for you of taking all of this and turning it into a book?
The first part is that my husband's an academic, and he said, you've got all this research, you really should go ahead and write the book. And having not done a book before, I thought, oh, well, 10 chapters, 12 chapters, it'll be like writing 10 or 12 term papers, and then I'll have a book. So I had no idea what was involved and how much work it was. In many respects, it was two books because one book was writing it, and then the other one was tracking down all of the images and getting all of the permissions from so many different sources to illustrate it. Because landscape architecture, of course, you can't really have a book about it without the images, especially her kind of work. So there were two books. And then there was no publisher out there that was interested in publishing my book. And I sent out some inquiries, and one of them was the Library of American Landscape History. And they took a look at some of my drafts and were very, very kind about directing what kind of changes would have to be made. But over that course of change, it was 2 or 3 years because I was working full time and I was writing the book, during my spare time. But eventually, it came together, and they put the book out, and it just received an enormous amount of um, enthusiasm somehow. Somehow, this woman, this tiny woman, who had worked really in obscurity for her entire career, had achieved a certain level of notoriety.
Yeah, and I think that's something you definitely pick up on and discuss throughout the book, all the different ways in which her work got out there. So I want to just, turn to talking about the book itself and Ruth's amazing life. Just before we kind of really take a deep dive in there, just to help people that may not know otherwise, to give them a kind of baseline here, could you maybe just start by talking about what a landscape architect is, what the profession is, and maybe how it's changed since Ruth started her work versus how it is now, if at all?
That's a good question. All of it's good news. When Ruth went to school, she went to Cornell, one of just a very few women in the landscape architecture program, and it was very rigorous. There were courses in surveying and many more courses in design, most of it focusing on residential or somehow estate era design, and very much influenced by the Beaux-Arts philosophy of design, which was highly organized based upon European gardens that had strong axes and garden ornamentation of a certain type. And so I think most landscape architects were doing that. There were people, like Frederick Law Olmsted, who was doing earlier on doing layouts of communities and planned unit developments for residences. But that would have been the sort of umbrella, a smaller umbrella. Today, the umbrella is so much bigger, so much bigger. It involves things that have to do with sustainability and a lot of commercial development that goes well beyond what would have been imagined when Ruth was working, and writing, of course, and research and huge projects. A friend of mine is working on a project really restoring an entire island in New Zealand, well, half of an island in New Zealand, and it had been devastated by all kinds of burrowing animals, and he's been working on it for 20 years and turned it into this very lush environment and restored it back to what it was before. So that's the umbrella that landscape architecture is now, and as compared to what the umbrella was that Ruth was working under.
Sure. And when you were talking right there, you mentioned something that I noticed during the course of the book. You said that Ruth was one of very few women in her class at Cornell. And just in a lot of the photos in the book, for example, Ruth is the only woman there, and she's sort of surrounded by men. So I guess I wanted to kind of check in and you mentioned in the text as well about what it was like for Ruth being a woman landscape architect in that time, considering that she was surrounded by men, and how did that change over time, and what did she have to deal with when just pursuing her career?
Yeah. I think it wasn't that easy for her. She had a wonderful attitude. It was this attitude of let's move on, let's look at the work and not worry about, what you think about the person who's doing it. But she encountered a lot of behavior, let's just say, that was difficult to put up with. Early on when she first started working in 1933, she was a pretty young woman and she wore skirts always to the job because she felt it was more dignified. But the contractors would ignore her, and one of them pinched her cheek once and called her honey, and she fired him. And she just kept moving forward, and she tried not to let it be too much of an issue. She didn't really want the focus of her work to be on that. So in many respects, she always told me she didn't think she was a feminist, but of course, I think how we define feminism now and how we defined it early in the 70s and all has changed. But she definitely did have the ability. She was very good at math. When they were working at Disneyland, every morning they were all given plans of what was going on to complete over the next couple of day or so. And she used to go through the maps with the engineers that were dealing with the roads and the grades for the buildings. And she would come in and she would hand them her comments on what wasn't working, and she told me one time that the curbs were going to be over 18 inches high in one place if it was built the way it was drawn. And the engineers, for whatever reason, treated her with a great deal of deference and respect, whereas the landscape crew run by Jack and Bill Evans, they were much more skeptical. And that may have had more to do with the fact that Ruth was brought on once they were already there, and they had not been trained the way Ruth was. So there may have been a little, bit of maybe professional, jealousy. I don't know. She had huge respect for them, and over the years they were all friends. But I think at that particular time they were thinking, "Gee, who's this woman coming in to fix up our work?"
Sure. And I think you also hit upon a really good point there, and something that I think you see across all of her work is her attention to detail, and whether she was correcting plans that were wrong, like you were talking about here with Disneyland, or otherwise really just paying close attention to every little thing, noting which specific tree branches needed to be pruned, where every little thing should go. She was very exacting. And I remember reading a quote, maybe it was the Charlie Munger quote, that Ruth was a quiet fanatic about quality work,
Yeah.
which I like that quote. So, what was her personality like? What were people's experiences working with her on projects?
She cared about her work more than anything else. And if it meant that she had to say something to get good work out of others and not be liked, she would do it. She had a file that was over an inch thick of correspondence with little Polaroids in it, working with a tree scout trying to find a tree for the Bullock's Wilshire project. And this went on for 6 months. There would be a letter, "Dear Miss Shellhorn, I have found this particular tree. What do you think?" And she would write back and say, "I told you, I want one where the branches are arching over only 45 degrees on the right, and it needs to be a full tree with this." And she'd draw a sketch and send it back. And then there would be a return letter a few days later with another one. This went on for 6 months. Finally, they found the tree that was right for her vision of what she had in mind. And then, of course, the photographs that I've seen of the project completed with the tree there, it really looks like a painting. It has a foreground, a middle ground, a background. It just looks like an artistic painting. And I think she brought those two parts of her personality, which was a really artistic appreciation of beauty, and then these math skills that she had, and she was able to put those together and create these projects that were beautiful, but were also technically installed perfectly um, and held up for a great long length of time.
Mm. And you also had mentioned when she was working early in her career, she was mentored by Ralph Cornell. What was that mentoring relationship like? How did she learn and grow from that?
I think he really was one of the most serious and positive influences in her professional life of anyone. When she got out of school, the first thing she did, it was the depths of the depression, but she went to visit him. And this was the great Ralph Cornell. By 1933, he was very well known. He came to be known as the grandfather of landscape architecture in Southern California. And he just took a liking to her. She said that he told her he liked her gumption. I love that word. It's so old fashioned, but that's what he used to describe her. And he was at that time reduced to working out of a rented space in an architect's office because work had pretty much dried up by 1933. And she had gone to ask him for work, and he said he didn't have any, but he said, you go out there and find work, start and go out on your own. And I don't think she had ever really considered doing that. She had always considered working for someone like him or someone like Florence Yock. And so this was an idea. And she said she walked out of the office and she thought, I can find work. Maybe it'll be small projects, but I can do it. And she decided to do it. And over the years, he stayed kind of hovering over her and making sure that things went well for her. He insisted that she join ASLA. He pushed her to go after jobs that were bigger than she thought she could take on. He invited her to dinner when landscape architects were coming to the home that he and his wife would entertain and hold dinner parties. And she was so shy. It was a struggle for her to sit at a dinner table and make small talk. But she went ahead and accepted these dinner invitations and went. And he eventually, later on, asked her to join him in a partnership. She always worked for him later after the Depression was over. She came in and did jobs for him when things were slow for herself. And he really respected her and he asked her to become a partner. But by then, she realized that if she became a partner of Ralph Cornell, she would always be under his shadow. He was just, too well known and too well respected. And she by then felt that she could do it. She could become the landscape architect that she wanted to be. And so she turned him down and continued to work on her own. And then with her husband, she took him on really as a partner. And they operated the office that she ran with just the two of them for the most part.
And I want to go back to something you mentioned at the very beginning. You talked about your experience visiting the Bullock's shopping square in I think it was in Sherman Oaks. Is that what you had said?
Bullock's Fashion Square, Sherman Oaks.
Yeah, Bullock's in Sherman Oaks, and all the stuff was interesting to me. As someone that grew up in Southern California and Los Angeles, it's interesting to think about who shapes your surroundings in all those places. So, especially that connection, the Bullock's connection and her partnership with Beckett. You really talk about that throughout the book as being a big one for her, and she worked to connect them all over the place. So, what did that really mean? How was Ruth working to redefine the shopping experience of people post World War II?
When Ruth started working for Bullock's, the first project was Bullock's Pasadena, and this was right after the war. Bullock's had this notion in mind, even during the war, to pursue putting department stores in suburban areas. And so after the war, they went ahead and pursued this project, and this is how Ruth met Welton Beckett. At the time, I think the prevailing idea about shopping was that you went out and shopped for the things that you needed. You went to the store and you got your bread and your milk, and if you needed a pair of boots, you went and bought them. And the Bullock's redefined or helped redefine this whole idea of shopping as recreation, shopping as fun, and shopping as a mini vacation, that you would go to the department store or the Fashion Square shopping center and spend a half a day. Ruth worked very hard to try and consider what it was like to be that shopper. She said she and her husband often built little mini models of the spaces, and she would, get down and look through them and walk through them mentally and try to figure out, mostly for what a woman with two children might be like, because that was sort of her target audience. And, what would you do after an hour of shopping if you needed to sit down? What do you do with the kids? Where can you sit? If you're going to sit, she wanted to make sure that the seating areas were situated in such a way that they would frame the view to an interesting store or, a place maybe near the parking area where you could sit down for a moment and find your keys. So she really, in some sense, I don't know that she ever thought about it this way, but it was kind of like a tea ceremony where you take an experience and you walk through it yourself and you measure the hiccups and the bumps that you're going to feel along that struggle to get to the end, and then fix all of them. So there's the bench to sit down and find your keys if your arms are laden with packages. It was the kind of design intensity that I think was so unusual about her. She really wanted to resolve the design experience.
Hmm. And as that continued to grow in terms of her practice, in the 40s, you kind of you cover really every decade here, and it seems like I couldn't figure out if she was nominated or won, but she was connected with this LA Times Woman of the Year award in 1955. And it seems like that was a big turning point that, wealthy clients began to be interested and use her and then recommend her to friends. And it really started to give her a little bit more publicity. And so, yeah, maybe talk a little bit about how things transitioned for her in that, between the 40s and 50s and as she became more high profile and how her work might have changed.
Yeah, that was a turning point. In 1955, she had finished working on the remodel of the Bullock's Wilshire, again with Welton Beckett. This was a very old, beautiful, iconic building in Los Angeles, and they added a large parking platform and structure in the back of the building. Beckett had been called in to do it, and Ruth redid the landscape for the project. And for whatever reason, and I don't know what prompted Bullock's to do that, but they put up a little plaque inside the atrium that she had also designed as a beautiful sort of miniature Japanese garden. And they put a plaque up crediting her with the work. And Buffy Chandler, the wife of Otis Chandler, who published the Los Angeles Times, saw the plaque and tracked her down and nominated her for Woman of the Year. And at that point, she had just finished Disneyland as well. So she got an enormous amount of publicity, more than she had ever had in her life. And I think things really launched because at that point, not only was she working with Beckett, but the whole crowd that Buffy Chandler was plugged into began to notice her, and they started hiring Ruth to do their residences and estates. And so she was really having a two-branched career of very high-end residential work and then also this commercial and retail work with Welton Beckett and others. She ended up working with a lot of other very well-known architects like Wallace Neff and Roland Coate and others. And I think you're right that was that turning point was that 1955 Woman of the Year award.
Yeah, and I noticed, throughout the book you have, in terms of her personal or her work with wealthy people, there's a lot of great photos of the gardens and the work that she did there, as well as photos of the commercial work. I guess I'm curious to know whether you think Ruth had a favorite, in the sense that, working for a wealthy person, maybe you could do something interesting with the garden, but it would be private. People aren't likely to be able to see it. Whereas, the commercial work, that's something people are going to be, there's a lot of high traffic going to department stores and people can really see her work and see what she's all about. Same for Disneyland, right? It's, a lot of people will see all of that. Did she have a preference for the type of work that she did as her career took off?
Maybe not for a type, but I think her hands down favorite project of all time was Bullock's Fashion Square Santa Ana. Um, by the time she took that project on, Bullock's basically said, "You do what we want and we'll build it." She had had enough projects behind her working with Bullock's where they trusted her completely. And she was able to influence a number of changes that very enthusiastic architects had proposed that she didn't think would work. And she loved that project, and it did. I interviewed a lot of people who uh, used and visited Bullock's Fashion Square, Santa Ana, after it was built, and it just somehow was one of those places where people felt, wow, this this place is special. That's where I really started to understand that people considered visiting her projects to be a mini vacation. People would go eat. Back in the day when they opened, they weren't even open on Sundays, but people would come out and visit the place. They would have picnics there. They would do paintings. We even had some photographs of people having their wedding pictures taken there. So I think she realized at that point that what she was doing, and also Sunset Magazine started publishing um, portions of her work at different fashion squares, and they were touting these articles as having design ideas that could be translated to the residential home, of do-it-yourself gardeners. And so she started to attract the attention of, I guess, for lack of a better word, I'd say the middle class. And she had many, many, many letters from people writing and wanting to know about certain trees. And so Sunset Magazine continued to publish her work over many years. And she came to prominence in this sort of level of work.
Hmm. And I noticed that she also got another big project. I think that was different for her when she did this campus work and getting to work on the UC Riverside campus and really influencing everything there. She took the time. I think this was 1961. She took the time to write a personal manifesto, which I think is pretty interesting, given at this point she had been working for around 30 years and really done a ton of projects. So what was her philosophy kind of at this point in her career by the time she gets to Riverside? And maybe how was it different, if at all, from when she first started out?
Well, first of all, just getting the project was a great story because Buffy Chandler also happened to be sitting on the Regents board for the UC system, and they needed a landscape architect for UC Riverside because Fred Barlow, who had been working there, had died very early. He was a friend of Ruth's, and he died early in his life, and they needed to bring someone else on. And Buffy Chandler said, "We don't have any women. We're going to do this." And she was a very strong-minded woman. And so the board agreed, and they hired Ruth to come out. And Ruth worked at UC Riverside for 8 years, which was, and it was during a period when the state of California had really stepped up to the plate to push expansion of the UC system. So there was an enormous amount of work going on at UC Riverside and at a lot of the other campuses as well. And there was also at that point in time, from a philosophical standpoint, these then new ideas about trying to deal with the land the way it was and not forcing design ideas onto the land. This was the transition well underway by now from Beaux-Arts to looking at design that worked with the land, that worked with the climate, that worked with how people were actually going to use the spaces. And she took a look at UC Riverside, beautiful, big campus with a lot of natural arroyos and rocks and scenic backgrounds with mountains silhouetted against the sky. And she decided we're not going to force this into some formal looking university. So she lobbied with the architect on the project, the Regents, to keep a lot of these arroyos, which are these, gullies that deal with deep runoff water during rainstorms, and keep those and not fill them in. So the campus is very spread out, and she designed these trails that would, meander along from, say, the dormitory to the main campus, and it would go trails down into the arroyos where they ended up having botanical gardens or using bridges to go over them. It has a very beautiful park-like feeling to it, and that was all due to her influence, which is still present today.
Yeah, that sounds beautiful, and I've been to that campus, so it's interesting to know the extent to which how much work was done to make these spaces the beautiful spaces that they are. I think sometimes it can sort of feel like maybe if the work is done really well, it feels natural almost to some degree.
Yeah.
And you don't realize, how much effort and time and, moving trees around and all of that was done to really get the space to be what it is.
Yeah, I agree. There's some writing manual I read once that said it takes 5 drafts in order to make it look like you didn't work on your text. And I think the same thing is true for the design. It's easy to just, design something that references something else, but to sit there and really look at the land and how it's shaped and the climate. Very hot out in Riverside, as you know, in the summer. And so she, at the time, really didn't have instructions on how to deal with water, but she looked at it and realized there was just no way that the entire campus could be irrigated. So the points of irrigation at UC Riverside are very carefully selected, and there's a lot of areas that have been planted in succulents and plants that don't use a lot of water. And I think she was really prescient in putting this together. It was not something that was, commonly in the realm of designers at the time to be thinking about that. It was a new idea.
Yeah. And even further, as we kind of go along her career here, you mentioned how her work in the 70s and 80s, she's still working. She has this incredible lifetime output. So in the 70s and 80s, you talk about how her work was exceptionally creative. And I just kind of wanted to check in on that and get a sense of how she was able to do that, to maintain that level of output and, maintain and even increase the level of creativity in her work as she got much older and been doing this for a long time. I think it's something that, some people tend to struggle with as they kind of head towards the twilight of their careers.
She worked. I don't think there was a week I can think of unless they took an occasional vacation once every 3 or 4 years. Um, Early on, when Bullock's Pasadena came on, her husband had been a banker and he quit his job, and she decided, because she was right in the middle of Bullock's, to ask him to help her out. And he did so, and they decided they liked working together. And over time, they never had children, so there was never any reason to re-examine. They worked together. He learned how to draft. He learned how to speak Spanish so he could work with construction crews, because in the beginning, she and her husband would hire the construction crews and then manage them themselves instead of having Bullocks have a project manager, which became the norm later. And she taught him how to draft well enough in order to do construction drawings, and he took care of all the billing and running her office. So she was free to really go ahead and focus on the creativity and the productivity of her office as a landscape architect without having to be the business manager. And so I think she was very lucky, and she had an art background, so she was always looking at her work from a creative level. And she had the ability to inspire trust in people. There was something about her, she looked a little bit like a prim school marm. She wore very sensible Oxford shoes, and she wore skirts to the site, and she was very definitive. And because she was so well educated and thorough, it came across in how she talked to people. They trusted her, and by trusting her, it gave her the opportunity to stretch a little. She wasn't always trying to have to convince people of different design ideas, because when she would explain what was going on and why, they felt like it was something they could get on board with. And as any designer knows, often sometimes working with the client can take up a really big part of the project time, trying to convince them of design ideas and educate them. I think she was very good at that. People over and over that I interviewed who had been her clients said that they considered her a friend. And that's always going to be true to some extent, but I think this was a greater extent than usual.
Yeah. And, after covering her life in a big way as part of kind of the first chunk of the book, the remainder of the book is actually a discussion of all these different projects that she did with all these drawings and photos and everything that you're able to gather from that archive. So I thought it'd be fun just to kind of pick one for me and have you pick a favorite and kind of discuss kind of the intricacies of those. And so my favorite one was Disneyland. I had no idea that she was really responsible for everything to do there, in terms of the landscaping and even working directly with Walt so much before opening day. And we've talked about it a little bit, but just curious to hear any other anecdotes or stories or ideas about, her partnership with Walt Disney and getting Disneyland going. And then if you had another particular project out of the list of projects you thought was especially noteworthy or that we haven't brought up yet you wanted to mention.
Um, Disneyland for Ruth really, in some respects, it's one of the it's an oddity because it was one of the shortest projects she ever worked on. She really only worked on Disneyland for about 4 months. The project was well underway, had been underway for a year, and Jack and Bill Evans of Evans Nursery had been brought on by Walt to do all the landscaping, and they had been driving around the Southland for 2 years, buying up large trees. The budget for landscaping wasn't very big, and Jack and Bill developed a whole network of relationships. It was the mid-century boom of building. They were building freeways and taking out all of the orchards all over the San Fernando Valley. And so they would turn up with trucks and cranes and haul all these big plant trees off to a nursery that was on the back lot of Disneyland and nurture them until there was time to find a place to put them. But neither Jack nor Bill had been trained as landscape architects in the way Ruth had. They had come up through the nurseries, as did many landscape architects of that era, but they, didn't know how to survey, and they didn't have drawing skills the way she did, and they hadn't been trained in design. And Walt was looking at this project getting built, and all the different lands were coming along, and everyone was working, but there wasn't really a way to link it all together in a cohesive way. And he was friends with Walt and Beckett said, "Bring Ruth Shellhorn on," and I don't recommend anyone else but her. So Walt called her and asked her to come out, and she was very reticent. She thought it was going to be, she said it was, thought it was going to be some kind of honky tonk, boardwalk amusement park. But she really liked Walt Disney, and she did agree to go out, and he was so enthusiastic, she decided to go ahead and do the job. And she jumped in. She was then working I say she was working 8 days a week because she told me there were a couple of nights every week where she just didn't go to bed because Walt Disney would meet them all on Saturdays and walk around and wave his arms and say, "Let's do this and let's do that." And then on Monday morning, the drawings were supposed to be there, ready to go. And his brother Roy would follow around and say, "Just do what he wants. We'll make it work." And so she did. And she showed up with drawings trying to get these done. In many cases, they didn't have drawings at all. There just wasn't time. I have a photograph of her standing out in front of the Sleeping Beauty Castle, directing the grading equipment to dig out the moat. They didn't even have drawings for that. She just kind of eyeballed it in. And I don't think you could get away with that anymore today, but it's the way Disneyland did get built, pell mell.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's how she got involved with the project. But then as time went on, the 4 months went by, they were working and working, and then there was the huge opening on July 17th, and she had to make a decision about whether to continue to work with Disneyland and essentially give up her entire other practice or not. So she had so many clients clamoring for her, and she really felt like Disney had Jack and Bill, and I think she would have liked to have stayed on at Disneyland, but I don't think she wanted to turn it into the only focus of her work. So she rolled up the drawings and put them away and jumped in the next day onto a new job. And that was the end of it. So it's kind of odd that she worked on the project for only 4 months, but it really is her most famous project in the sense that people really relate to Disneyland all over the world.
Yeah. And did you have one project that you really liked?
Yes, but I'm going to add one more thing. Ruth was
Sure.
very careful to say over and over. There was a huge amount of publicity, of course, but over and over she was careful to say, "I did not do this alone. I mean, there were thousands of talented people working at Disneyland, and along with Jack and Bill, and they had a crew of people working out the irrigation and everything else. And Jack had been super. He had been just so meticulous about picking different plants out, and so she would go with them into the nursery to pick out plants that she thought would work. But it really was a team effort, and even though she did go ahead and do the layout for the pedestrian movement throughout the park, she was very careful to say over and over that she did not do this alone. She did not do the landscape of Disneyland by herself with Walt Disney. It was really a team effort. Anyway, that said.
Yeah.
Okay, a favorite project that would be impossible, but why don't we pick Bullock's Wilshire since we've already got a little background on it in this interview. Um, she came into this project and up until now working with Bullock, she had been able to influence all kinds of things, the parking, the access to the streets, the layout of the building, the transition from parking area to the buildings. She didn't have any of that here. She and Beckett were working on a project that was already pretty much in place. So in some respects, it was a refurbishment, but I would call it a super refurbishment. She completely reanalyzed the spaces throughout the whole project, including the streetscape. And at the time, Asian culture was very popular, and she took that as a cue and used that as a design reference in the design for the property. So many of the clients were well traveled and well educated, and it had a slightly exotic appeal. So there was an area leading from the parking area into the building. What they called it the porte cochere, and she designed a garden there, and it was the garden that used that tree that she had the tree scouts searching for so long, and it was a ornamental pear tree, Pyrus kawakami, and she created that space like a painting. It had, a whole series of small, medium, and large textures, and it was organized to look like a space. And she took rocks that she had found in up in the San Gabriel Mountains and used them to form a path that went deep into the planting pocket, and it gave it a lot of depth and three-dimensionality. And people, this was what they saw when they walked from their cars out in that sun into the shade, see this garden, and then moved into the store. She always felt like it kind of set up the whole experience of now you're moving into something that's artistic and interesting and beautiful. And she did that again inside the building with the atrium, where she had only a little square that was about 10 by 10 feet, and it didn't get a lot of light. So she created again another painting, a three-dimensional painting with plant material that one would think of as belonging to, say, a Japanese garden. And because of the low light, the plants didn't last very long, but Bullocks loved the response of their visitors, so their shoppers. And so they would replace the plant materials every few months as they started to die, so that it always looked good. And that was where they placed the little bronze plaque that was seen by Buffy Chandler in 1955.
Right.
So that is one of my favorites.
Yeah, that sounds great. I would have loved to see it. All right. Well, I think we can kind of wrap it up a little bit. And just to check in with you, are there any ideas or concepts or anything else about Ruth that you think people should know that we haven't had a chance to talk about yet today?
I would just say in sum, I think that what Ruth's work was, who she was, and the time that she worked, I really think of her work as a very strong visual representation of mid-century landscape architecture in Southern California. Her work was always referred to as the California look, that kind of thing. People felt that what she did defined this space. And I think it's still true. You can drive through Los Angeles now, and the presence of Welton Beckett's work and the work she did with him are still visible. And I think a lot of it is what people think of as defining our regional identity. And she was a big part of that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's pretty incredible to have that level of influence on an entire region like that. So definitely makes this book worthwhile, I think, to understand how that happened and the person behind it.
One project, which was the Prudential Center, I went ahead and
Hmm.
included the plant list that she used there, and um, I did that because I knew that people were always asking me, well, what kind of plants should I use if I want to make it look like mid-century? And so it kind of serves as a kind of a reference list, I guess. And I think that's useful if a lot of people are buying and fixing up mid-century residences and commercial areas. Like Palm Springs, for instance, has a real renaissance in mid-century. And people want to know what kind of plants were used during that era that can work with the structures that were built in that era.
I think, yeah, great selling point. Another reason to pick up the book. Uh, cool. Well, all right, let's do a quick thunder round and we'll call it a day. Sound good?
That sounds great. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about Ruth again. I love it.
Yeah, yeah. All right. So what's your favorite food or drink?
Ooh, favorite food. It's got to be something with chocolate.
Okay.
Favorite
Nice.
drink. Uh, I don't know. I love sparkling water with lemon in it, which is kind of boring, but it's really good.
I mean, yeah, it tastes delicious. I'm right there with you.
Yeah.
Where's your favorite place you've ever been?
In my whole life, uh,
Yeah. Or one of them.
I like Greece very much. I've been 3 times. I've been to China a number of times. I've been to Japan several times. I like to travel. Did a lot more of it earlier in my life because there's too much work now. How about yourself? What's your
Hmm.
favorite place?
Ooh, good question. I also love to travel and have been many, many, many places. Um, there was a little tiny island just southeast of Bali called Nusa Lembongan in Indonesia that I visited.
Hmm.
That was really wonderful. And it's one of those spots where not a lot of people even stay the night. It still has a lot of day trips, but so at nighttime, there's not much light. So you can walk outside and just kind of see the entirety of the night sky. You can see the Milky Way, you can see a million stars. So it really helps you get that feeling like you're connected to nature and just disconnected from the world.
That
So
sounds
I had a
beautiful.
really just wonderful week there. Yeah, it's a beautiful, beautiful place. And last question, if you could wave a magic wand and change any one thing, what would it be and why?
In my life, in the planet, in politics,
It's your magic wand. It's all powerful.
I'd like to live a long time because I'm having a lot of fun. I'd really like to be
Ha.
able to have influence on that. I'm finding as I get older, the experience that I've gained and knowledge is actually really useful. And work is much more fun now. I feel more confident about my work, and I'd like to last a little longer than maybe I'm entitled to because I'm just enjoying it so much.
Oh, fair enough. I think that's a great answer. All right. Well, Kelly, thanks so much for talking. The book again, Ruth Shellhorn, a fantastic portrait of this amazing woman. And Kelly Comras, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much, John. Nice talking with you.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Read, Learn, Live. If you liked it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. If you hated it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. And so it goes.